Hey guys, tonight we begin with a ruin, one of the most recognizable skeletons of the ancient world, Colosseum of Rome. Before we get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment telling me where you're rewatching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's drifting off to Roman history from across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft hum in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey. When the Colosseum opened in 80 CE, it wasn't the half-broken tourist magnet we see today. No, back then, it was the Beyoncé of Roman architecture, flawless, dramatic, and impossible to ignore. Officially, it was called the Flavian Amphitheater, but Romans didn't care for long names. They just pointed and said, the Colosseum, partly because of the colossal statue of Nero standing nearby, and partly because Flavian Amphitheater sounded like a bad law firm. The thing was enormous, minus 50,000 seats, 80 entrances, and marble so bright you probably needed sunglasses. It wasn't just a stadium, it was Rome showing off, a statement in stone that said, we have more concrete, more slaves, and more free time than anyone else on earth. Senators lounged in the best seats. Peasants squashed themselves into the upper tiers, but everyone got the same view, a blood-splattered spectacle. When Emperor Titus cut the ribbon, he didn't settle for a modest opening. He hosted 100 straight days of games, like Netflix autoplay, but with more stabbing. Gladiators fought to the death. Wild animals were slaughtered, and in one because we can moment, the Romans flooded the arena to stage mock naval battles. Who needs running water for the city when you can have an indoor murder lake? Animals came from every corner of the empire, lions from Africa, bears from the Alps, elephants, crocodiles, ostriches. The Colosseum was basically Noah's Ark, if Noah had been a psychopath with a taste for dramatic irony. None of these creatures lasted long, of course, but their deaths made for excellent halftime shows. The poor got free bread and gore, the rich got to feel superior, and the emperors got something priceless, applause that didn't involve daggers. It was politics disguised as entertainment. Sure, your taxes were high, but look, free lions. In the building itself, a marvel of Roman engineering. Arches stacked like poetry. Iron clamps holding blocks so tight they still baffle modern engineers. Elevators run by sweating slaves, popping animals into the arena like some ancient vending machine. In its prime, the Colosseum was perfect, round, gleaming, and uncracked. No goats, no rubble, no tourists with selfie sticks. If you'd told a Roman that one day it would lose half its body, they'd have laughed and ordered another round of executions. Because in Rome, forever meant until the earthquakes show up. For centuries, the Colosseum served two purposes, entertainment and execution. It was a place where blood met sand, and no one left without seeing death, unless they were blind, in which case they just got free bread. Gladiators were the stars, not all slaves. Some were volunteers chasing glory. Imagine being so bored with life that you choose to fight lions for applause. Win enough fights and you might earn freedom. Lose and you became fertilizer for the arena floor. And the Romans loved variety. They didn't just kill men, they staged entire battles. Prisoners of war were forced to reenact Rome's victories, playing barbarians in scripts that ended with their real deaths. It was theater, with actual corpses. By conservative estimates, hundreds of thousands died inside those walls. Humans, animals, didn't matter. Colosseum drank blood like wine. Centuries later, people whispered it was haunted. Honestly, it would have been shocking if it wasn't. Yet, through all of it, the building stood tall. Stone arches shrugged off centuries of slaughter. Even as the arena floor turned into a compost heap of bones and sweat, the structure endured. The humans did not. By the 5th century, Rome was falling apart. Emperors were dying faster than bread loaves could rise, and the treasury was emptier than a peasant's stomach. The games that once defined Roman grandeur fizzled out. The last recorded gladiator fight took place in 404 CE. After that, the Colosseum fell silent. No more roars, no more lions, no more emperors waving from balconies. Christianity was on the rise, and the church wasn't exactly a fan of blood sport. Hard to preach mercy on Sunday and cheer on executions Monday, so the Colosseum just sat there, waiting, watching, a giant stone ghost in the heart of a dying empire. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, they didn't even bother destroying it. Why waste energy? The real show was already over. By the Middle Ages, locals walked past daily, probably muttering, someone should fix that thing, and never did. The Colosseum wasn't a monument anymore. It was just that massive crumbling circle in the middle of town. It hadn't even started losing stones yet. That part was still to come. For now, it was just fading like a once famous actor doing cheap commercials. And then came the earthquakes. Rome's ancient engineers could handle time, but not tectonics. In 847 CE, a massive quake struck. The southern wall, that graceful curve of stone and marble, collapsed in a roar of dust and centuries of memories. What emperors, popes, and barbarians hadn't destroyed, the earth finished off in one violent shake. The Colosseum went from majestic ruin to, well, at least half of it still standing. The southern side sat on weaker soil, and when the ground gave way, so did history's most famous circle. The north half clung on, the south crumbled away, leaving behind the lopsided monument we see today. A building forever caught between glory and ruin, like a before and after photo of civilization itself. And the tremors didn't stop there. More quakes followed, more stones loosened. Locals scavenged the fallen marble to build their own homes, churches, and palaces. Every earthquake turned the Colosseum into the world's biggest hardware store. The mighty arena that once echoed with screams and applause was now a quarry of memories, a skeleton Rome slowly picked clean. And so the Colosseum endured, half alive, half gone, still standing, still watching, as the city around it moved on. Because, in the end, Rome's greatest monument to power and cruelty was undone not by time or war, but by the quiet, patient hands of nature and the even quieter greed of men. Huge slabs of travertine lay scattered across the ground, not in chaos, in neat, tempting piles. Perfect. Why mourn a broken amphitheater when you could turn its ribs into your brand new church facade? And the more the earth trembled, the more free building materials arrived. The Colosseum didn't just fall apart, it was being politely delivered to the rest of Rome, one tremor at a time. After the quake of 847 CE, the mighty arena looked battered, still recognizable, like a heavyweight fighter after a brutal round, bruised but still on his feet. It could still stand in the ring, but the earth wasn't finished. Not yet. In 1349, Rome was hit again, and this time the Colosseum went down hard. The quake ripped through the city with the fury of a god who'd finally had enough of Roman arrogance. Entire sections of the southern wall folded inward, arches snapped, tiers collapsed, and what had once been the symbol of eternal strength was suddenly a half-eaten cake. Rome's greatest monument had been bitten clean through, and nobody was rushing to bake the missing half back. Of course, medieval Romans didn't see tragedy. They saw opportunity, divine delivery. Even those fallen slabs of travertine that once held emperors, gladiators, and the screams of 100,000 voices. Now they were just lying there, ready to be reused. Builders, stonemasons, and opportunists descended on the wreckage like bargain hunters at a yard sale. Why quarrying new stone when the Colosseum itself was practically begging you to help yourself? And so they did. The south side of the Colosseum, the part that bore the brunt of the quake, was never rebuilt. The northern half soldiered on, stubborn as ever, while the southern wall became a jagged ruin, a permanent scar against the Roman skyline. From that point forward, the Colosseum wasn't a grand arena anymore. It was a broken circle, a fossil of imperial glory, and a daily reminder that Rome's golden age was long gone. And once the stones began to vanish, there was no stopping it. Repairing the Colosseum stopped being an idea. Mining it became the new business model. The 1349 earthquake hadn't just shattered the building, it had shattered the belief that it should remain whole. From that day on, the Colosseum became a public quarry. Stones were carted away to build palaces, churches, and fountains, scattered like confetti across the eternal city. Ironically, the same material that once celebrated Rome's might now build the monuments of its decay. The fatal blow hadn't come from barbarian swords or centuries of blood-soaked games. No, it came from the ground itself, shrugging once and saying, enough. After the quake of 1349, no one looked to the Colosseum as a wounded masterpiece. They saw it as an extremely convenient pile of luxury stone. Rome had officially rebranded its greatest monument from imperial icon to public supply depot. Think about it. Why trek out to distant quarries when the finest travertine in Italy was lying free in the center of town? No backbreaking labor, no transport costs. Just stroll over, pry out a few blocks, and congratulations, you're now a medieval contractor. It was recycling, but with less environmental guilt and a lot more vandalism. Noble families got in on the action first, of course. Palaces don't build themselves, and nothing said old money quite like walls made of Colosseum marble. Bit by bit, those fallen arches were reborn as the elegant facades of Rome's elite mansions. The Frangipani family even went a step further. They fortified part of the Colosseum itself, turning it into their personal fortress. Rome's greatest symbol of public entertainment had become private property. A place once filled with gladiators and lions was now home to noble guards and family banners. The Colosseum had survived emperors, wars, and centuries of slaughter, but it could not survive real estate. Because why stop at looting when you can move in? The medieval Romans certainly didn't, and neither did the church. If you've ever marveled at the splendor of St. Peter's Basilica, or wandered through Rome's grand fountains and marble churches, you've already admired pieces of the Colosseum without even realizing it. Those glimmering stones once echoed with the screams of gladiators. Now they rest quietly beneath frescoes of saints. When the empire fell, the church saw an opportunity. The Colosseum wasn't a pagan monument anymore. It was a gold mine of free, pre-cut marble, and the popes were more than happy to turn a symbol of blood and empire into God's personal renovation project. Need a column? Take one from the arena. Need stone for the altar? Help yourself. Rome's most famous landmark had become a medieval hardware store. The Colosseum didn't collapse in one grand disaster. It was picked apart, gently, methodically, over centuries. Earthquakes loosened the stones. People carted them off. Rome's greatest amphitheater didn't die. It was repurposed. Piece by piece, it bled into the city that surrounded it. By the late Middle Ages, calling it a Colosseum was generous. It was more like a massive open-air quarry, or a haunted warehouse filled with ghosts of lions and emperors. And then came the noble families. Here was one thing medieval nobles loved more than gold. It was showing off that gold, preferably from inside someone else's ruins. By the 12th century, the Colosseum wasn't just being looted, it was being lived in. The Frangipani family claimed it first. These were Rome's classic power brokers, rich, ruthless, and not above declaring this half-broken arena is ours now. They fortified it, walled it off, and turned the arena into a private castle. The stands where gladiators once fought became banquet halls. The corridors that once smelled of blood now reeked of roasted boar and spilled wine. It was the strangest kind of luxury. Silk-robed nobles sipping wine in the same arches where slaves had died centuries before. Soon the Annibaldi family moved in too, because in medieval Rome, Nothing said status like claiming a chunk of ancient history. They built towers, reinforced walls, and made the ruin their fortress. The Colosseum had become prime real estate, a medieval penthouse with panoramic views and excellent acoustics for political backstabbing. The nobles didn't care about restoration. They weren't preserving the Colosseum. They were using it, its bulk, its legacy, its bones, to broadcast power. Those massive arches that once echoed with cheers now loomed as defensive ramparts. Imagine being invited to dinner, walking past crumbling statues, through the shadows of history itself, while your host brags about how many lions once died beneath his living room floor. It was absurd, glorious, and completely Roman. By then, the Colosseum was no longer a monument. It was a medieval joke, its broken crown worn proudly by a city that couldn't stop cannibalizing its own past. And the popes, they didn't just allow it, they perfected it. The Vatican turned the Colosseum into its personal quarry. Why dig new stone when the empire had left a mountain of it waiting? Need marble for a basilica? Take it. Want to build a palace? The Colosseums got plenty. Pope Gregory the Great even encouraged the reuse of pagan materials, because nothing says triumph of Christianity quite like tearing down a monument to Roman gods and using it to build cathedrals. Soon, every new church in Rome gleamed with fragments of the old amphitheater, St. Peter's Basilica, decorated with slabs once drenched in gladiator blood. Cain couldn't be richer. The same arena where Christians were once killed now glorified the faith that survived them. And as the popes stripped marble, they also ripped out the Colosseum's iron clamps, the literal metal staples that held it together. They melted them down for other projects, leaving behind pockmarks that scarred the walls to this day. It was like pulling the nails out of your house and wondering why the roof fell in. By the time the papacy was done, the Colosseum wasn't a ruin. It was a skeleton, corpse, dismantled and scattered through the veins of the city. Every fountain, every palace, every church in medieval Rome carried a piece of it. The Colosseum didn't disappear. Rome simply rearranged it. The Colosseum wasn't just stone and marble. It was muscle, held together by thousands of iron clamps, the ancient equivalent of industrial duct tape. Each of those clamps kept the enormous travertine blocks from slipping apart. The Romans, always obsessed with precision, even poured molten lead around them to seal everything tight. It was engineering genius, the kind that let an empire build for eternity. But eternity doesn't last when the neighbors need scrap metal. Centuries later, those same clamps became irresistible to medieval scavengers. Iron was rare, expensive, and essential. You couldn't make weapons, tools, or even horseshoes without it. So when the world's largest pile of pre-cut high-grade iron sat right in the middle of Rome, temptation was too strong. And so, one by one, the clamps disappeared. Men hacked into the Colosseum's bones with chisels and hammers, prying out the metal that once held the empire's might together. The result, rows of holes, gashes, and scars, still visible today, marking where each clamp was stolen. Every theft made the structure weaker. It was like pulling the bolts out of a bridge and then wondering why it fell. Whole walls shifted, vaults sagged, arches cracked. What had been a miracle of Roman engineering was reduced to a pockmarked ruin, a masterpiece slowly eaten alive by necessity. And the most tragic part, that iron didn't even become anything glorious. No cathedral gates, no royal armor. Most of it probably ended up as nails, horseshoes, or farming tools. The Colosseum was dismantled, traded for plows and shovels. A world wonder undone because someone needed better cutlery. Even today, those scars remain. Tour guides call them spolia, a polite Latin term meaning reused material, a less polite translation. Proof that medieval Romans loved free hardware. So, if you've ever wondered why half the Colosseum is missing, don't just blame earthquakes. Claim the guy whose great-great-grandfather needed to fix his cart. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum wasn't just a ruin. It was real estate. Those great arches that once thundered with the screams of dying gladiators now echoed with the shouts of merchants. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that people will sell vegetables literally anywhere. The lower arches became perfect storefronts. Bakers set up ovens, smiths hammered away at iron, and butchers displayed fresh cuts of meat in the same spaces where lions once tore into prisoners. Nothing says fresh product quite like buying sausage under a centuries-old bloodstain. But the Colosseum didn't stop at being a marketplace. It became a home. Families moved in, turning ancient corridors into makeshift apartments. Imagine waking up, stepping outside your door, and realizing you live inside history's most famous killing arena. For medieval Romans, that was just Tuesday. Of course, these weren't luxury suites. The roof leaked, rubble fell, and the walls occasionally gave way. But hey, the rent was unbeatable. You could live in the heart of Rome, surrounded by marble, ghosts, and the occasional goat. Workshops filled the arches, blacksmiths, tanners, carpenters, all hammering, sawing, shouting beneath the shadow of fallen emperors. You can almost imagine the advertisement: come for the history, stay for the low rent. The world's greatest amphitheater had officially been downgraded to a medieval strip mall with bonus haunting ambience. Travelers who visited Rome during this time were stunned. They expected a monument and instead found a crumbling bazaar with smoke curling from chimneys built into ancient walls and children chasing chickens across the arena floor. It was less ruin of the empire and more haunted shopping district. And the strangest part, nobody thought it was odd. To medieval Romans, ruins weren't sacred. They were useful. The Colosseum wasn't a monument to preserve. It was free space, conveniently located and full of building materials. If emperors had known their grand arena would one day be rented out to butchers and blacksmiths, they might have built it smaller and with less accessible iron. Eventually, the Colosseum found a new, even humbler role. Once it was a stadium, then a fortress, then a market. Now it became a barn. The arena that once thundered with the naval battles and gladiator duels turned into pasture land. Sheep and goats grazed where emperors once sat in gilded seats. Nothing says fall of empire quite like livestock chewing grass on the stage of Roman glory. Travelers wrote about it, astonished to see herds of animals wandering calmly across the same arena floor where men once fought to the death. The mighty roars of 50,000 spectators replaced by the gentle bleating of goats. Anticlimactic, sure, but probably healthier for everyone involved. Goats didn't care about imperial ambition or architectural symmetry. They cared about weeds, and the Colosseum had plenty. Grass and wildflowers sprouted from its cracks, turning the place into an overgrown buffet. Shepherds thought, why not? Free grazing. And so, the arena of emperors became Rome's cheapest pasture. To medieval Romans, it made perfect sense. Ruins weren't treasures. They were opportunities. Need a fortress. Move in, need stone. Dismantle it, need grassland. Toss in some goats. It's history, practicality, and irony all grazing together under the Italian sun. Foreign visitors found it shocking, even funny. Pilgrims arrived, expecting the heart of the Roman Empire, and instead found what looked like a ruined village green full of sheep. One chronicler summed it up best: it is not a monument, it is a meadow. And in a strange way, the goats became the Colosseum's most loyal audience. They never missed a show, century after century. Those ancient walls could speak. They might sigh and say, out of all the crowds I've hosted, the goats were the easiest. Rome's blood-soaked arena had become a petting zoo. Not exactly the legacy the Flavian emperors had in mind, but perhaps the most honest one. By the Middle Ages, the Colosseum had stopped being Rome's grand stage and started feeling like something out of a ghost story. Locals no longer saw it as an arena. They saw it as a haunted cathedral of bones. Hundreds of thousands had died there, gladiators, slaves, prisoners of war, and wild animals. The place was less monument to empire and more mass grave, disguised as architecture. People swore they heard strange noises echoing through the arches at night. Ghostly clashes, cold winds, sighing through the stone, and eerie bleeding that turned out to be, quote, usually just goats. But that didn't make it any less creepy. For many Romans, the Colosseum wasn't a ruin. It was cursed. Christians, meanwhile, claimed it as sacred ground, the site where countless martyrs had died for their faith. Whether that was true or not didn't really matter. The story stuck. Pilgrims came not to admire the ruins of empire, but to kneel where they believed saints had fallen. Popes leaned into this idea, declaring the Colosseum a holy site, partly out of faith, partly because it stopped people from tearing the place down completely. It didn't entirely work. While some came to pray, others came to steal. The Colosseum's marble and iron were too valuable to ignore. To some, it was sacred. To others, it was a free construction supply store. And so, the amphitheater lived a double life, church by day, ghost story by night, and a very convenient quarry for anyone needing building material. As centuries passed, nature decided to join in. With no one maintaining the place, cracks spread through the walls. Weeds sprouted from the arena floor, and trees began growing out of the arches, like strange green fireworks. By the 14th century, the Colosseum looked less like a ruin and more like a jungle wrapped around ancient stone. Scholars of the Renaissance were astonished. They found hundreds of plant species growing in the ruin. Some exotic, likely carried centuries earlier in the fur of lions or on the sandals of gladiators. Nature was doing what earthquakes and looters had started, dismantling the Colosseum root by root. Every sapling was a tiny wrecking crew, prying apart Rome's greatest monument, inch by inch. But medieval Romans didn't see this as a tragedy. They just shrugged. After all, the Colosseum had already survived emperors, popes, goats, and time itself. By the 15th century, the arena was half ruin, half garden, the world's strangest fusion of death and life. Nobody dreamed of restoring it. Preservation wasn't a medieval concept. Stones weren't relics of the past. They were resources. The fallen blocks of the Colosseum became part of homes, churches, and even pieces of the Vatican. And that was the final irony. The Colosseum, once Rome's loudest symbol of imperial power, ended up quietly holding up the walls of the city that had outlived it. Its missing half wasn't mourned. It was recycled. A monument that once roared with the screams of gladiators became, in the end, a silent supplier of bricks, a ghost of empire, still serving Rome long after the empire itself was gone, which is the polite way of saying, wow, this wreck is massive. Everyday Romans simply lived around it. They sold bread beneath its arches, grazed goats on the arena floor, and treated one of the wonders of the ancient world like an oversized backdrop to daily life. Restoration. Nobody even thought of it. To the people of the Middle Ages, the Colosseum wasn't something to fix. It was already perfect in its ruin. By the late medieval period, it had gone from imperial centerpiece to public quarry to city barnyard. And as the centuries passed, it settled comfortably into its final role, the world's most majestic pile of rubble. By the 1500s, the Colosseum had achieved something few ruins ever do. It became part of everything else. Its stones didn't vanish, they simply moved. If you've ever admired the facade of a grand basilica, the curves of a papal palace, or the sparkle of a Renaissance fountain, chances are you were looking at a fragment of the missing Colosseum. The empire had fallen, but its building materials were still clocking in for work. Popes were some of the most enthusiastic recyclers. Why dig up new quarries when you could just peel marble from the Colosseum like old wallpaper? St. Peter's Basilica, built with Colosseum stone. Vatican palaces, same story. The amphitheater, once soaked in pagan blood, was now literally supporting the house of God. divine bit of recycling that Rome seemed very proud of. Teddy's noble families joined in too. Owning chunks of the Colosseum became a status symbol. Nothing said ancient prestige, like decorating your mansion with slabs stolen from the empire's greatest monument. Meanwhile, regular citizens helped themselves to smaller pieces for staircases, workshops, and flooring. The Colosseum had turned into the medieval equivalent of a hardware aisle, and no one felt even a little guilty about it. By then, the monument's identity wasn't just broken, it was scattered. Half of it still loomed over the city center, cracked and overgrown with plants. The other half had been quietly absorbed into the skyline, hiding in plain sight. If you wanted to see the Colosseum in the 1500s, you didn't go to the Arena, you went on a scavenger hunt across Rome. And the irony: nobody saw this cannibalization as destruction. To the people of the time, it was progress. Why let a pagan ruin rot when you could build something new with it? The Colosseum wasn't half missing. It was everywhere reborn, reimagined, and repurposed one block at a time. So what happened to the missing half of the Colosseum? It didn't crumble into dust or disappear. It became churches, fountains, palaces, staircases, and chimneys. It became Rome itself. The Colosseum didn't die transformed, stone by stone. It dissolved into the living fabric of the city. Rome didn't lose the Colosseum. Rome became the Colosseum. The lifeblood of the Roman army was in tea. The glint of bronze or the clash of steel was grain. More than a ration, it was the true engine of conquest. Each legionary carried roughly 3 Roman pounds of wheat per day in his pack. Heavy, monotonous, and absolutely vital. Without it, Rome's campaigns from the misty forest of Germania to the burning sands of Syria would have ground to a halt. Keen was the great equalizer. Whether you were a decorated veteran or a terrified new recruit, your daily ration was the same. In the legions, bread not gold was the real currency. But getting from sack to stomach wasn't simple. Roman soldiers marched with their kitchens on their backs. Amid the armor, javelins, and tents, each man carried a small hand mill. After hours of marching beneath a brutal Mediterranean sun, soldiers would collapse into camp, roll up their sleeves, and start grinding grain. The process was noisy, exhausting, and coated everything in a fine layer of dust, but it was non-negotiable. Flour meant bread, and bread meant another day alive. Their meals were plain and practical, sometimes rough loaves baked over campfire embers, other times flat cakes pressed onto heated stones. On longer campaigns, they'd bake double portions, letting some harden into military hardtack, chewy, tasteless, but nearly indestructible. The taste of discipline, dull, repetitive, reliable. Grain's real power lay in its predictability. Unlike herds that needed grazing or vegetables that spoiled quickly, wheat could be stored, measured, and moved with mathematical precision. Roman supply lines weren't chains of feasting feasts. They were lines of mule carts stacked high with sacks of wheat. Generals understood one unshakable truth: a hungry legion couldn't fight, no matter how brave its soldiers were. Julius Caesar himself once wrote that the first duty of a commander wasn't strategy or speeches, it was keeping his men fed. So, when we imagine Rome's mighty legions, we shouldn't just see shields flashing in sunlight or banners snapping in the wind. We should picture exhausted men crouched by the campfire after a long march, grinding grain into flour, turning kernels into survival, and survival into empire. The sword might have carved Rome's dominion, but grain was the quiet force that sustained it. If bread was the fuel of Rome's armies, then Pascha was the drink that kept them going. And no, it wasn't the fine, perfumed wine of Roman banquets. Kostka was the soldier's brew, sour, sharp, and more vinegar than vintage. For the common legionary, though, it was indispensable. A simple mix of water and cheap, spoiled wine, or sometimes just vinegar diluted enough to drink. Pascha was the taste of endurance. To a modern tongue, it would seem like punishment. To a Roman soldier, it tasted like safety, refreshment, and resilience. The reason was brutally practical. Water could kill you. Rivers and wells, especially in foreign lands, were crawling with disease. A mouthful of the wrong stream could wipe out a camp in days. Vinegar, however, disinfected. It killed what the eye couldn't see. Mixed with water, it made drinking safe and stretched supplies to last longer. In essence, Pascha was the Roman sports drink, hydrating, cleansing, and essential for survival. It also had another benefit. It woke you up. After marching 30 kilometers under a blazing sun, weighed down by armor and 30 kilos of gear, that bite of vinegar on the tongue was a jolt of life. Sharp, bracing, almost electric. And Pascha wasn't just a drink, it was a statement. Generals and emperors were known to drink it publicly to show solidarity with their troops, a symbolic gesture. The leader who shared the soldiers' sour brew proved he shared their hardships. To sip Pascha was to embody Roman virtue, discipline, austerity, endurance. Of course, soldiers joked about it endlessly. Nobody serenaded Pascha in poetry or toasted lovers with it under the moon. It was sour, unromantic, unforgettable, much like the army itself. Bread in one hand, sour wine in the other, and another mile of road beneath their sandals. If wheat was their foundation and Pascha their refreshment, then salted pork was their anchor. Protein wrapped in salt and necessity. Fresh meat was a luxury few ancient people tasted regularly, but the Roman legionary could count on his salted pork ration. It wasn't soft or savory. It was tough, briny, and practical. Salt was the magic. Rubbed and packed into the meat, it preserved it for weeks, sometimes months, under the Mediterranean sun. Soldiers carried slabs in their packs, boiling them to soften the texture or roasting strips over open fires. The taste, harsh, salty, greasy, repetitive, but it built muscle, warded off exhaustion, and kept them marching. As one historian put it, salted pork was the soldier's shield against fatigue. More than food, it symbolized Rome's genius for organization. Supply officers ensured that carts of preserved meat followed every army, forming a moving network of nourishment. Where other armies scavenged or starved, Rome's legions ate with precision. Salted pork wasn't just a meal, it was proof that logistics could win empires. Still, the soldiers mocked it. After weeks of chewing the same greasy slab, many joked that the pork was harder to stomach than an enemy charge. They mixed it with lentils, soaked it in vinegar, or traded it for something fresher when possible. Yet, the pork endured, stubborn, unyielding, and dependable, just like the men who carried it. Then came cheese, the legionaries' modest comfort. Dense, portable, and surprisingly nourishing. Rome favored aged cheeses, hard as stone, but lasting for weeks. They were compact miracles, rich in fat and protein, balancing out the endless grain and meat. Cheese wasn't just sustenance, it was morale. Soldiers melted it into porridge, crumbled it into stews, or simply gnawed it straight from their packs. That small taste of home reminded them of distant farms, of Italy's hills, of the lives they left behind. For a man freezing in Gaul or sweating in Judea, a piece of cheese could be a memory that kept him human, and it was reliable. Grain could mold, pork could rot, but hard cheese survived rain, snow, and desert heat. It became the quiet cornerstone of Rome's logistics, food that lasted as long as the campaign itself. Soldiers joked about breaking teeth on it, but they never complained when it was gone. If bread fueled their bellies, pork fueled their strength, and cheese lifted their spirits, vinegar kept them alive. It was more than an ingredient. It was preservation, medicine, and cleansing all in one. Vinegar softened old bread, cured meat, disinfected wounds, soothed throats, and calmed sick stomachs. A splash of it could mean the difference between infection and recovery. In an age without antibiotics, that sting was a soldier's best defense. It was also mental armor. The sharpness jolted the senses, the taste of vigilance. Roman generals praised it as the flavor of discipline. Sweet wine softened men, they said. Vinegar hardened them. And so, the legion learned to love its bitterness, because it worked. The Roman legionary wasn't just a fighter, he was a walking kitchen. Each man carried his own pantry strapped to a furca, a wooden pole slung over his shoulder, hung with a cooking pot, pan, and his food: grain, pork, cheese, vinegar. It looked more like the pack of a wandering peasant than that of a soldier. But this was Rome's secret weapon: self-sufficiency. Unlike other armies, Rome didn't depend entirely on wagons or camp followers. Every soldier could cook for himself. For a long march, once the ditches were dug and the walls built, the air filled with smoke and the chatter of men preparing dinner. Thousands of fires lit the night. Bread baked on stones, pork simmered, cheese melted into stew. It was genius. The army could move faster, survive longer, and fight harder than its enemies because it carried its kitchen with it. It also built brotherhood. 8 men to a tent, cooking, eating, laughing, cursing became family. Round those campfires, the Roman army found its heart. It wasn't glamorous. Smoke stung eyes, meals burned, and exhaustion made tempers short. But routine bred survival. To skip the grindstone was to invite weakness. Every soldier knew food was discipline, and discipline was life. A Roman soldier's world was measured not in years, but in miles. 20 kilometers, 30, sometimes more. Step after step, burden after burden, carrying not just weapons, but his entire livelihood on his back. Rome's power came not from luxury, but from endurance. Bread, pork, cheese, vinegar, the simple things that conquered the world. No feasts, no silver cups, just the taste of resilience, the taste of empire. Hunger did not rule the Roman legions. Discipline did. And yet, even the might of Rome had its limits. When the supply lines faltered and rations thinned, soldiers turned to the land itself. They foraged in forests, plucked wild herbs from the roadside, and seized what they could from nearby villages. Many campaigns in history didn't end with a clash of steel, but with the quiet gnawing of empty stomachs. Rome's greatest battles were often fought not against enemies, but against distance, exhaustion, and hunger. For all of Rome's legendary logistics, every march was a gamble. Move too slowly, and the rations would vanish before the next convoy arrived. Move too quickly, and exhaustion claimed the men faster than any sword could. But more often than not, Rome prevailed. The image of a legionary trudging through the dust, packed heavy with grain, pork, and vinegar, wasn't just a picture of survival. It was strategy made flesh. The Roman ration was as essential as the gladius: grain, pork, cheese, vinegar, the holy quartet of endurance. Day after day, the meals were monotonous, but dependable. And when the battles ended, when victory had been won and blood had dried on armor, that same food transformed from mere sustenance into celebration. The feast after battle was sacred, a ritual of triumph, morale, and gratitude. It wasn't just about eating, it was about restoring what war had drained. When the fighting stopped and the spoils were secured, the camp came alive with the sounds of butchery and fire. The baggage animals, kept safe during the clash, were slaughtered first. Smoke rose into the night as fresh meat, real, tender meat, replaced the salted slabs of the march. The air filled with the aroma of roasting beef, lamb, and goat. Men who had chewed on dry rations for weeks now tore into juicy cuts, their laughter echoing under the stars. And the wine flowed, not the sharp sour pasca of the march, but true wine, rich and red. For a night, the army forgot its burdens. The feast became a theater of joy. The clatter of trenchers, the warmth of the fire, the bond of brotherhood rekindled. Commanders knew the power of this ritual. A well-fed soldier was a loyal one. Generals often distributed captured food and wine as rewards, sealing devotion through full bellies and shared spoils. Rome's victories were measured not just in territory gained, but in feasts shared. These moments of indulgence were fleeting, but they burned bright in memory. Soldiers endured the bitterness of vinegar and the salt of pork, because they knew that victory promised a night of warmth and plenty. Even then, discipline never vanished completely. The Roman feast was controlled chaos, revelry tempered by order. For tomorrow, another march would begin, another battle would call. When we think of Rome's power, we picture shining armor, battle cries, and endless ranks beneath imperial standards. But the empire's real strength came from something humbler: food. Rome conquered not only through force, but through sustenance. The legions could feed themselves anywhere, move faster than their enemies, and fight longer because they never starved. Bread, pork, cheese, vinegar, these were Rome's true weapons. Logistics became strategy. Camps turned into moving cities, complete with mills, ovens, and portable kitchens. While rival armies starved or pillaged, Rome's legions endured. They could march weeks through hostile lands, carrying not luxury, but life itself. Their rations weren't meant to please, they were meant to endure, and that endurance built an empire. Food also shaped identity. Every soldier from Gaul to Syria ate the same meal. They spoke different tongues, prayed to different gods, but at mealtime, they were all Roman. Bread from the same sack, pork from the same barrel, vinegar from the same flask. It was unity through simplicity, a shared struggle that bound them tighter than chains of command ever could. Even centuries later, when the empire began to crumble, it wasn't just the walls or armies that fell, it was the food. Broken supply lines, empty granaries, and the loss of fertile provinces did more to destroy Rome than any barbarian horde. In the end, Rome fell when it could no longer feed itself, because Rome's greatness, its discipline, endurance, and power was built on the most basic human truth. A full stomach marches farther than an empty one. Grain was its lifeblood, its pork, its strength, cheese, its comfort, vinegar, its protection. Together, they built an empire more lasting than marble. And when the fires of Rome dimmed, another fire burned to life far to the north. To step inside a Saxon mead hall was to step into the living heart of another world. From the outside, these wooden halls were humble, long timbered buildings with thatched roofs sloping against the rain and walls sealed tight against the cold. But within, they came alive. At the center burned the hearth, a great fire whose glow painted the walls in gold and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of smoke, wood, and roasting meat. The hearth was not just a source of heat, it was the soul of the hall, the flame around which life itself gathered. In a land of harsh winters and endless nights, fire meant more than survival. It meant community. It drew warriors, lords, poets, and servants beneath one roof, binding them together in warmth and kinship. At night, the mead hall became a theater of fellowship. Warriors returned from battle, their mail glinting in the firelight, their laughter loud and heavy with mead. Their lord sat at the high table, glowing in the same fire that reflected off the faces of those sworn to him. Around them, servants moved briskly, pouring horns of honey to drink, carrying platters of steaming meat and coarse bread. Every feast in the hall was a ceremony, not just of food, but of loyalty and order. The placement at the table, the size of a man's portion, these were unspoken measures of honor. A generous cut of meat meant respect. A seat near the Lord meant favor. The feast was a mirror of Saxon society, a blend of joy, duty, and hierarchy. And yet, beneath the structure, it pulsed with warmth. Laughter echoed under the rafters, dogs curled near the hearth, and the mead flowed freely. To eat together was to belong. To share bread and drink from the same horn was to affirm loyalty and kinship. The Saxon lord's generosity was more than custom, it was currency. By feeding his men, he fed their loyalty. By rewarding them with gifts, gold, rings, cloaks, weapons, he bound them in an unbreakable circle of honor. In return, the warriors gave their oaths, their service, and their blood. Thus, Every feast was a renewal of strength, of trust, of unity. For one night, the cold outside was forgotten. Hunger, hardship, and war all faded beneath the glow of the hearth. In Saxon culture, to feast was to live. To be welcomed at the table was to be part of something larger, a fellowship held together by firelight and shared bread. To be denied, it was exile. The meat hall was more than a building. It was memory, tradition, and the beating heart of a people who found meaning not in marble cities, but in the warmth of a shared flame. If bread and meat nourished the body, mead nourished the soul. To the Saxons, it was far more than a drink. It was liquid culture, the golden lifeblood that threaded through every feast and gathering. Brewed from honey, water, and the herbs of the countryside, mead carried the sweetness of summer and the labor of bees. Then the mead hall, it became something transcendent, the drink of warriors, poets, and kings. Drinking was never a solitary act. Horns and cups passed down the benches, each refilled by tireless servants weaving through the haze of smoke and song. To lift a horn of mead was to share more than a drink. It was to reaffirm fellowship, loyalty, and the fragile peace among men who lived always on the edge of war. Mead loosened laughter, freed tongues, and lent courage to those who wavered. Under its golden influence, warriors boasted of battles, poets recited sagas, and lords made promises that could alter the fate of their people. Mead was more than a social bond. It was symbolic. The honey it came from was seen as divine, a sacred gift of the gods, bestowing life, wisdom, and strength. To drink mead was to sip the blessing of heaven. Poets called it liquid gold. Warriors believed it fueled not only their bodies, but their bravery. Drinking also reflected hierarchy. The lord always received the first and finest horn, served with ceremony by a noble cupbearer. This was more than hospitality. It was ritual. Every gaze turned to the high table as the lord raised his drink, firelight glinting off his ringed hand. When he drank, he confirmed his rule as protector and provider. When his men followed, they renewed their loyalty. But mead's warmth could turn. Too much could ignite tempers as easily as laughter. Feasts that began in harmony sometimes ended in chaos, with blood and mead staining the floor. Yet, even this was part of the hall as rhythm, fellowship forever tested by passion and pride. In the end, mead was memory made liquid, the drink of life, loyalty, and remembrance in a hard and fleeting world. At the head of every hall sat its master, the Saxon lord, or lafford, literally giver of bread. His role was as much spiritual as political. The mead hall existed because of him, yet his worth was proven within it. Its power rested not only on his sword, but on his generosity. When the feast began, all eyes turned to his high seat. The lord welcomed guests, presided over alliances, and distributed food and gifts. Rings, weapons, and finely woven cloaks were not luxuries, but tokens of loyalty, each one a silent promise, binding men together. Generosity was strength. A lord who hoarded treasure soon found himself alone. One who shared it could turn even meager wealth into enduring devotion. The mead hall was his theater. Every act, the pouring of the first horn, the giving of gold, part of the performance of leadership. He was also the hall's protector, responsible for the safety of those who feasted under his roof. The glow of the hearth reflected his might. While it burned, his people felt secure. Poets praised such lords, not only for victory in battle, but for the warmth they brought in peace. Yet this duty was heavy. To fail in generosity or protection meant the unraveling of loyalty. In the end, the Saxon lord was not merely a warrior. He was a host whose strength was measured in the loyalty gathered around his fire. The lord was the hall's heart. The poets were its voice. Known as shops or bards, they carried not just songs, but the memory of the people. In a world without books, their verses were the living archive of a culture. The mead hall, smoky and firelit, became their stage. When a poet stood, horn in hand, the murmurs stilled. His words could resurrect the past, the clash of ancient battles, the glory of dead heroes, the rise and fall of kings. These were not mere stories, a teed, they were instruction. Through rhythm and verse, the scop taught courage, warned against betrayal, and upheld the virtues of honor and generosity. A well-told saga was as powerful as any blade, shaping how men saw themselves. For warriors, to be remembered in song was immortality. Death was not the end if the bard's voice carried one's name into eternity. The content of their songs varied, some heroic, some mournful, others satirical, but all carried weight. The poet's words could elevate or destroy. Music often accompanied the verse, the soft pulse of harpstrings beneath the crackle of flame. In these moments, the hall became not merely a place of feasting, but of learning and legacy. The poet ensured that courage was remembered, treachery condemned, and the spirit of the hall preserved across generations. The mead hall was also the courtroom of loyalty, the place where oaths were sworn, witnessed, and sealed. Under the fire's glow, with the taste of meat on their lips, warriors pledged their lives to their lord. These vows were sacred. In the comitatus, the warrior band, each man bound himself by word and honor. The lord promised food, protection, and reward. The warrior swore courage and fidelity. When an oath was spoken aloud before the company, it bound not just the men, but the entire fellowship. To break it was exile and shame. Rituals lent weight to the moment, a hand upon the sword, or on the shared mead horn, binding word to steal and drink alike. Poets stood witness, ensuring that every promise was remembered and every betrayal condemned in song. A good lord returned loyalty with gifts, gold rings, swords, or shields, visible symbols of trust. Thus, the mead hall became both treasury and tribunal, where the currency of loyalty was minted in words and wine. Such vows went deeper than politics. It bound lives together. Tales told by poets celebrated those who fell beside their lords rather than flee, for loyalty was worth more than life. The hall's lesson was clear. Oaths were sacred fire. To betray them was to grow cold. Though mead halls are often imagined as the realm of men, women shaped their very souls. Their presence brought order, grace, and continuity to a world of steel and smoke. The cupbearer, often a wife, daughter, or noble kinswoman, held one of the most important roles in the ritual of feasting. Moving among warriors with the mead horn in her hands, she served not merely drink, but dignity. Each man who received the cup acknowledged his place in the fellowship. Her role was peace embodied, her presence a reminder that loyalty and kinship were as vital as valor. Her gestures carried weight equal to any command. When she offered the horn, alliances were confirmed, oaths renewed, and grudges softened. Women also guarded memory. While poets sang of glory, it was often women who sang of grief, laments that reminded men of the cost of their courage. Their voices balanced the hall's spirit, blending triumph with sorrow. Many held quiet influence, advising their lords, guiding diplomacy through tone and ritual. The mead hall, therefore, was not just a fortress of warriors, but the heart of a family, its fire tended by both strength and grace. In their hands, the hall's legacy endured, its warmth passed from one generation to the next. Like the endless refilling of a mead horn beneath the flicker of eternal flame. To be forgotten was true death. To be remembered was glory. Warriors often fought, not just for land or loot, but for the promise that the scop would one day sing of them beneath the glow of the hearth. The content of these performances ranged widely. Some were heroic epics, recounting mighty battles. Others were elegy, lamenting loss and the fleeting nature of life. Still others carried humor or satire, poking fun at rivals or even lords who failed their duties. In every case, the poet wielded power. His tongue could praise or shame, build reputations or tear them down. Often music accompanied the poetry. A harp or lyre provided a steady rhythm underscoring the cadence of the words. The hall became a symphony of fire crackling, warriors murmuring, and strings resonating beneath the voice of the bard. In these moments, the Mee Hall was not only a place of feasting, but of culture, a school without walls, a theater without a stage. The poet's role was essential. He ensured that victories were remembered, defeats explained, and the values of the community reaffirmed. In the Saxon world, where memory was fragile and death always near, the voice of the storyteller was the closest thing to eternity. The Saxon Mee Hall was not only a place of feasting and storytelling. It was also a courtroom of loyalty, where bonds between lord and warrior were forged and renewed. Here, under the gaze of firelight, and with a taste of me on their lips, men swore oaths that bound their lives to their leaders. These were not casual promises. In a world where treachery meant ruin, an oath in the hall was sacred, sealed before both comrades and gods. At the heart of this system was the Comitatus, the warrior band. Each man pledged himself to his lord, promising courage in battle and faithfulness in peace. In return, the lord swore to provide protection, food, and reward. The Mee Hall gave this bond its stage. When a warrior lifted his horn and declared his loyalty, it was not just to the lord sitting at the high table. It was to every man in the hall who heard him. Breaking such an oath brought not only disgrace, but exile. The rituals were steeped in symbolism. Warriors often swore with hands placed on weapons, invoking the steel they would wield for their lord. Some touched a communal mahorn as they spoke, linking their oath to the drink that united the hall. The presence of poets ensured that these vows were remembered. A man who pledged boldly in the hall but failed to act bravely on the battlefield could expect to hear his cowardice sung of in mocking verse for years to come. Loyalty was also reciprocal. A good lord publicly acknowledged his men's oaths with gifts, rings, swords, shields, or cloaks. These were not bribes, but symbols of trust, visible proof that the warrior was part of his lord's household. The more generous the lord, the stronger the loyalty he commanded. In this exchange, the Mee Hall became both courtroom and treasury, where promises were forged in drink, memory, and wealth. Yet, the oaths went beyond politics. They bound lives together. A warrior's promise meant he would not abandon his comrades, even if death came. Tales told in the hall celebrated not only victories, but the steadfastness of men who died beside their lords rather than flee. Such stories reinforced the hall's central lesson. Loyalty was worth more than life. Thus, the Saxon Mee Hall was more than a place of warmth and me. It was the crucible of trust, where words carried the weight of blood and oaths echoed louder than the crackling of the hearth fire. Though mead halls are often remembered as the domain of warriors and lords, women played a vital role within their smoky rafters. They were not merely background figures. Their presence shaped the tone, ritual, and very meaning of the hall. The cupbearer, often the wife, daughter, or trusted kinswoman of the lord, was central to the life of the feast. Carrying the great horn of me from man to man, she moved with dignity and care, ensuring each warrior drank in turn. This ritual was not simply about serving. It was about order, hierarchy, and respect. To receive the horn from her hands was to be recognized as part of the fellowship. Her role symbolized peace in a world dominated by violence. Her woman's movement through the hall softened the edge of rivalry, reminding warriors that loyalty was as much about community as it was about bloodshed. She embodied continuity, linking households together through marriage, kinship, and ritual. In many stories, the moment a queen or noblewoman presented the mee cup was when alliances were confirmed, oaths renewed, and tension dissolved. Her gestures carried political weight equal to any sword. Women were also keepers of memory. While male poets recited heroic deeds, women were often the mourners, their voices carrying laments that reminded men of the cost of war. Their songs, quieter but no less powerful, ensured that loss was remembered alongside victory. This duality, celebration from poets, sorrow from women, balanced the emotional life of the hall. Some women held influence beyond ritual. A powerful lady might act as counselor to her lord, whispering advice in private, but reinforcing it in public through her ritual duties. Her presence in the hall reminded warriors that leadership was not solitary. It was sustained by household and kin. In this way, the Mi Hall became not just a fortress of warriors, but the heart of an extended family. And of course, women were symbols of continuity. While warriors might die in foreign fields, women carried forward lineages, ensuring the survival of families and tribes. Their presence at the feast was a reminder that loyalty was not only to a lord, but to future generations. Thus, though the Mi Hall songs often glorified the clash of swords, it was the quiet, steady presence of women, cupbearers, mourners, and counselors that gave the hall its deeper humanity. Without them, the fellowship of warriors risked becoming only noise and blood. The Saxon Mi Hall was more than a roof over heads. It was architecture with meaning, built to embody belonging and power. From the outside, the hall might appear simple, a long wooden building. Its thatched roof pitched steeply against the rain, smoke curling from gaps in the beams. But step inside, and its design revealed its true purpose: to gather, to unify, and to impress. The hall's shape was deliberate, long and rectangular, so when just running down its length, it naturally directed all eyes toward the high seat at the far end. There, elevated above the rest, the Lord presided, the hearth fire's glow dancing across his face. This arrangement was no accident. Placed hierarchy into the very bones of the building. The physical space mirrored the social order. Lord at the head, warriors ranked along the sides, servants and newcomers toward the edges. Every plank and beam reinforced who belonged where. At the center burned the hearth, the hall's true heart, positioned so its smoke rose through the roof's opening. It lit and warmed the entire space. But it was more than practical. The hearth symbolized community itself, the fire around which people gathered, the light that pushed back darkness. No corner of the hall was untouched by its glow. To sit in its warmth was to be part of the whole. To be outside was to be forgotten. The architecture also amplified experience. The high ceilings carried sound, making the clash of laughter, song, and poetry echo grandly. Rafters darkened by smoke became canvases for memory. Each stained a reminder of years of feasting. Carved posts and decorated beams sometimes displayed patterns of beasts or knots, linking the structure to myth and tradition. The hall was not just built, it was inscribed with identity. Importantly, the Mi Hall was a communal space, not private property. Unlike the Lord's sleeping chamber or a warrior's tent, it belonged to everyone who had earned a place within it. Its architecture invited participation: long tables for shared meals, benches for collective sitting, open space for poetry and storytelling. It was designed to erase isolation, to make each man feel part of a larger brotherhood. Thus, the Mi Hall was not only timber and thatch, it was a building that spoke. Its walls reminded warriors of loyalty, its hearth of unity, its high seat of authority. Its threshold was a step into belonging, to no one's place within a community bound by firelight and fellowship. Though the smoke of Saxon hearts has long since faded, the Mi Hall's legacy lingers in story, language, and cultural memory. These wooden halls, once filled with the laughter of warriors and the drone of poets, were not merely buildings, they were symbols of identity. They represented the center of community life, It's the place where power was displayed, loyalty sworn, and memory preserved. Even after their timbers rotted, their echoes survived in legend. Epic poems like Beowulf immortalized the meat hall as a stage for both celebration and conflict. Hrothgar's Harrod, the Hall of the Heart, stands as an archetype, golden, bright, and alive with song, until threatened by the monster Grunel. The hall in these tales is more than backdrop. It is character. Its fall or survival mirrors the fate of its people. The Saxons may not have written much themselves, but their descendants preserved the image of the Mee Hall as a cultural heart. The hall's influence also shaped medieval concepts of kingship and hospitality. Later, great halls of Norman and English castles carried forward the tradition. High tables, central hearths, communal feasting. Cute. Even today, when we picture medieval banquets, we unconsciously trace the Saxon model. The idea that a ruler proves his worth by feeding and rewarding followers is an inheritance from those smoky timber halls. The Mee Hall's legacy lies not only in architecture or ritual, but in values. It embodied the balance of generosity and loyalty, of storytelling and memory. Warriors sought glory, but it was the hall that guaranteed remembrance. Poets sang of deeds, women passed the horn, lords gave gifts, all within walls that bound the community into one. The Saxon Mee Hall taught that belonging is built not on stone, but on shared ritual. Even modern notions of fellowship, whether in clubs, taverns, or even the idea of a common room, owe something to this heritage. The glow of fire, the sharing of drink, the telling of stories. These are ancient rhythms that continue to define how humans bond. The Mee Hall may have been unique to its time, but the longing it fulfilled, warmth, kinship, remembrance, is timeless. In the end, the legacy of the Saxon Mee Hall is not its timber or thatch, but its spirit. Wherever people gather around a fire, lift a drink, and tell stories to remember who they are, the old halls live again. For the Saxons, time was not measured in neat rows of ink on parchment, but in the steady heartbeat of the natural world. The rise of the sun, the fall of the moon, the greening of fields, and the withering of leaves all told them what the calendar could not. Life was bound to cycles of sowing and harvest, of cold and warmth, of hunger and plenty. And at each crucial moment of these cycles, the Saxons gathered in ritual and feast, marking their place in the great wheel of the year. These gatherings were not frivolous distractions from hard work. They were the glue that bound community together. In a world without certainty, festivals gave rhythm and reassurance. The harsh winter nights, when frost gnawed at doors and the sun seemed reluctant to return, were answered by blazing fires and shared meal. The restless days of spring, when fields demanded planting and warriors sharpened their spears, were marked by rites that blessed fertility and promised renewal. Even harvest itself, exhausting as it was, ended in celebration. A reminder that toil bore fruit and the community would endure another year. Religion lay at the heart of these cycles. Pagan gods and ancestral spirits were honored at feasts with offerings of grain, meat, and drink. Fires symbolized the rebirth of the sun, while songs carried prayers for good fortune and safety in battle. To participate in a festival was to participate in the sacred order of things. A reminder that man's work on earth was tied to forces greater than himself. Yet these events were not all solemnity. They were also occasions of joy, laughter, and abundance in lives that were otherwise marked by hardship. Tables filled with roasted meats, horns of meat passed from hand to hand, and music echoed through the halls. People sang, danced, and told stories that stitched the community together. Festival was a rare moment when hunger gave way to plenty, fear to hope, isolation to belonging. For the Saxons, then the year was not a straight line, but a circle. Each festival turned the wheel, marking both an ending and a beginning. Through fire, food, and fellowship, The Saxons not only survived the seasons, they gave them meaning. When winter pressed hardest, when the night stretched long and the earth seemed lifeless, the Saxons turned to Ule. This midwinter festival was more than a holiday. It was an act of defiance against the cold and dark. The people lit great bonfires, some in open fields, others in the hearths of mehalls, flames leaping high, as if to call back the sun itself. Fire was not just warmth, it was a promise, a living symbol that light would return and that life had not been abandoned by the gods. Ule was marked by abundance, though it came in the leanest time of year. Families gathered in halls, heavy with the smell of roasting meats, pork, venison, or whatever the hunters could bring in. Bread was baked, ale brewed, and most importantly, the drinking horns of mead flowed without end. The sharing of food and drink in such difficult months was no small thing. It reinforced solidarity. No one faced the long night alone. Your Lord filled your plate and horn at Ule. He was not just feeding you. He was proving his worth as a provider, the one who could lead you safely through scarcity. The religious element was inseparable. Wayfires honored the gods and spirits of the ancestors, calling for protection through the dangerous winter months. Offerings of food and drink were cast into the flames, smoke rising as a bridge between the mortal and the divine. Warriors often used this time to boast of past deeds or swear new oaths. The fire itself serving as witness to their pledges. Just as the sun would return after its darkest hour, so too would loyalty endure after the trials of war. It was also a time of inversion, when the ordinary rules of life relaxed. Stories tell of games, contests, and mischief, with laughter filling the smoke-filled halls. Ule was not merely a pause from hardship, it was a celebration of survival. Children received gifts carved from wood or bone, tokens of joy to brighten the darkest season. Above all, Ule reminded the Saxons that even in the depth of winter, life still pulsed. Fire blazed, drink warmed, and fellowship held firm. In that glow, they saw not only the end of one year, but the birth of another, a cycle unbroken. If Ule was about survival in the dark, spring festivals were about renewal in the light. As the frost loosened its grip and the first shoots broke through the soil, the Saxons turned to rituals of fertility, celebrations that honored the earth's awakening and called upon the gods to bless fields, herds, and families with abundance. In a world where one failed harvest could mean starvation, these rites were not quaint superstition, they were urgent acts of hope. The season's rituals often centered on the goddess Aostra, whose name lingers in our word Easter. She was associated with dawn, rebirth, and fertility. Her symbols tied to hares, eggs, and the returning sun. Offerings of bread, milk, and honey were made in her honor, placed on altars or buried in the earth as gifts to ensure the land's generosity. Fires were lit at dawn, their smoke curling skyward like prayers for good harvests. Communal feasting was an essential part of these spring rites. Fresh lamb and early greens often marked the tables, along with the last reserves of stored grain. Eating together symbolized shared renewal. The community would not only survive the winter, but flourish in the year ahead. Mead horns circulated and songs filled the air, many of them celebrating fertility not only in fields, but in families. Weddings and betrothals often coincided with these festivals, binding human unions to the earth's own cycles of rebirth. The rites themselves could be playful as well as sacred. Young men and women participated in games that carried symbolic meaning. Races, dances, and contests of strength that mirrored the vigor of new life. Some traditions involved scattering ashes or blessing fields with fire and water. Rituals meant to cleanse and fertilize the soil. Every act, whether solemn or spirited, carried the same message. Life returns, and with it, the promise of abundance. For warriors, spring rites had their own weight. The season marked the start of campaigning, when roads and fields were clear enough for armies to move. Oaths taken during fertility rites bound warriors to their lords as firmly as the plows bound farmers to their soil. Thus, spring was both a season of crops and of conflict, its rituals shaping not just the year's food, but the year's battles. Spring fertility festivals reminded the Saxons that life was fragile, yet resilient. Every seed swung was an act of faith, every rite a declaration that death and darkness would not have the final word. If spring was about hope and sowing, the harvest festival was about proof and reward. After months of toil in the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, and praying, the Saxons marked the season of reaping with one of their most important celebrations. The harvest feast was both thanksgiving and survival strategy, a moment when the community could finally see the fruits of their labor piled high before them. The timing varied with the crops, but late summer and early autumn were the busiest months. Barley, oats, wheat, and rye were gathered along with fruits from orchards and whatever livestock could be called for winter stores. Fields that had once been bare now yielded bounty, and the mead hall tables groaned with roasted meats, loaves of fresh bread, and bowls of grain porridge made from the new harvest. Brewed from the fresh barley and honey-rich mead marked the occasion with drink as golden as the fields themselves. But the feast was not only about filling bellies. Tea was steeped in ritual. The first sheath of grain was often dedicated to the gods, sometimes set aside in a place of honor or burned as an offering. This act symbolized gratitude and acknowledged that abundance came not by human hands alone, but by divine favor. The harvest feast was as much about appeasing unseen powers as it was about enjoying the visible bounty. The celebration also reinforced community bonds. Everyone from lords and warriors to farmers, craftsmen, and children shared in the feast. For one night, differences of ranks softened, replaced by the shared relief that the stores were full and the winter would be endured. Songs praised not only the gods, but the labor of men and women who had bent their backs in the fields. Dances often followed, their steps echoing the rhythms of planting and reaping. Turning hard labor into art. For the Lord, the harvest feast was a moment of generosity. To distribute food and drink freely was to prove his role as protector and provider. To withhold would be shameful. Abundance was expected. Gifts might even be given, tokens of gratitude for loyal service during the hard months. The harvest feast was not only a marker of survival, it was a declaration of continuity. Each year's bounty carried the promise of another cycle, another turning of the great wheel of seasons. In a land where famine always lurked, this festival was both relief and renewal, a reminder that toil and faith could indeed bring reward. Not all Saxon feasts were tied to the soil. Some were born of blood and steel. When warbands returned from raids or campaigns, victorious or merely surviving, the mead hall became the stage for their triumph. These were not quiet suppers, but roaring victory feasts where warriors' deeds were praised. Loot was divided, and loyalty between lord and men was reaffirmed in food, drink, and ritual. The feast often began with display. Weapons taken from enemies, captured banners, or exotic goods from distant lands were paraded before the gathered crowd. Warriors seated at the benches waited for their share. Sometimes silver, sometimes livestock, sometimes even slaves or jewelry. Yet the greatest rewards were often symbolic. A lord presenting a warrior with a new sword or ring in front of his peers. To receive such a gift during the feast was to be publicly honored, your courage enshrined in memory. Food and drink flowed as freely as the boasting. Roasted meats, sometimes the spoils of the raid itself, were piled high, and horns of meat were never empty. The atmosphere was electric, filled with laughter, song, and the inevitable contests of words. Warriors would boast of their victories, sometimes truthfully, sometimes with exaggeration, while poets recorded their words in song. These boasts were not idle bragging, okay? Were a kind of currency, a way to establish honor and demand recognition, okay? The victory feast was also a political act, okay? By distributing spoils, the Lord proved his generosity. By rewarding bravery, he secured loyalty. A lord who was stingy or forgetful during such a feast risked losing the respect of his warriors, perhaps even their service. In contrast, the generous feast could ensure loyalty for years. It was no accident that lords often planned the most lavish celebrations after successful campaigns. The hall itself became a battlefield where loyalty was won, not with swords, but with bread and meat. These feasts also carried ritual weight. Oaths of loyalty might be renewed, sometimes dramatically, with warriors swearing on their weapons or raising their horns in solemn pledges. The poet's verses immortalized these moments, ensuring that glory would not fade with the dying fire. For the Saxons, victory feasts transformed violence into order. Bloodshed outside became fellowship inside. The Mee Hall turned the chaos of war into the structure of loyalty, weaving courage into community through fire, food, and story. For the Saxons, feasting was never only about survival or celebration. It was also sacred. At certain times of the year, food and drink became offerings, bridging the human world with the divine. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting tied the community not only to one another, but to their gods, ancestors, and the unseen forces that governed fate. The most common sacrifices were animals. Cattle, sheep, or swine were offered during great festivals. Their blood spilled as a gift to the gods of harvest, war, or fertility. The act was solemn, often accompanied by prayers, chants, or the lighting of ritual fires. Yet the sacrifice was not wasteful. After the gods were honored, the meat was roasted and shared among the people. This practice blurred the line between offering and feast. To eat the sacrificed animal was to take part in the blessing, to consume both nourishment and divine favor. These sacred feasts often took place in the Mee Hall, but sometimes they were held outdoors at sacred groves or stone sites. Fires were lit, food prepared, and horns of meat raised in toasts to deities such as Woden, Thunder, or Frigr. Each toast was both prayer and promise, asking for protection in war, fertility for the fields, or good fortune for the coming season. In this way, every bite and every sip became an act of devotion. The role of the Lord during these feasts was crucial. He acted as both host and priest, guiding the rituals and ensuring the offerings were made correctly. His ability to connect his people with the divine reinforced his authority. A Lord who led the feast well showed not only generosity, but spiritual power. His rule was sanctified by fire, food, and the gods themselves. Yet these occasions were not only solemn, sacred feasts were also communal celebrations. After the sacrifices were made, the atmosphere often shifted to joy. Music swelled, storytellers performed, and the people feasted deep into the night. For the Saxons, piety and pleasure were not opposites. They were partners. To honor the gods was to celebrate life, and to celebrate life was to honor the gods. Religious sacrifice and sacred feasting reminded the Saxons that survival was never a human achievement alone. The gods provided, the ancestors watched, and the people responded with gratitude, offerings, and joy. In those moments, the line between the mortal and the divine blurred, and the hall glowed with more than firelight. It glowed with blessing. No Saxon festival was complete without entertainment. Once the sacrifices were made, the feasting done, and the meat flowing, the Mee Hall or village green transformed into a stage of laughter, competition, and music. Games, music, and merriment were more than diversions, were rituals of joy, a way to bind communities through play as much as through prayer. The games varied with the season, In spring and summer, when the weather allowed, athletic contests dominated. Wrestling matches tested strength, while spear throwing and archery displayed martial skill. Young warriors proved themselves before their elders, earning admiration and sometimes mockery if they fell short. These contests were not idle sport, but training for battle disguised as entertainment. Victory brought prestige and losing built resilience. The community watched, cheered, and remembered. Here, winter games were often played indoors within the warmth of the hall. Dice, knucklebones, and board games such as Taffle filled the long nights, their clatter echoing beneath the rafters. These games mixed chance with strategy, echoing the Saxon view of life. Fate ruled all, but skill still mattered. Laughter and groans at the fall of dice reminded everyone that luck was as much a player as any man. Music carried equal weight. Harps, lyres, and drums provided rhythm for songs that could stir hearts or soothe weary souls. Skilled musicians could lift a hall into a frenzy or silence it into reverence. Poets and bards recited tales of gods, kings, and heroes, weaving entertainment with cultural memory. To hear one's ancestors honored in verse was as sweet as me, and to have one's own deeds sung was to taste immortality. Dance, too, filled the spaces between contests and song. Men and women moved in circles, stamping feet and clapping hands, their motions echoing the cycles of nature and the rhythm of community. Children ran between the dancers, mimicking their steps, already learning the traditions that would one day be theirs to keep alive. But perhaps the greatest mirth was simply the laughter. Festivals allowed space for humor, for jesters and fools to mock even the highest lord. Their antics, tolerated in the spirit of release in a world of hard work, hunger, and danger. These moments of levity were essential. They reminded the Saxons that life was not only duty and survival, but also joy. Through games, music, and merriment, festivals balanced the sacred with the playful. They turned survival into celebration, making the bonds of fellowship stronger with every laugh, song, and contest. For the Saxons, festivals were not isolated events, but markers on the great wheel of the year. Each celebration announced a turning point in the cycle of nature, guiding people through darkness and light, scarcity and abundance. Unlike our modern calendars, where dates are abstract numbers, the Saxons lived by rhythms they could see and feel. The thaw of the earth, the height of the sun, the shortening of days. Every feast was both an ending and a beginning. Winter ended with Ule, when fire and me pushed back the cold and called for the return of light. From there, the cycle turned towards spring fertility rites, which celebrated planting, rebirth, and hope. These were not just rituals of survival, but statements of faith. That seeds buried in the soil would rise, that life would outlast death, that the gods would not abandon their people. Summer brought its own gatherings, often tied to midsummer fires. These flames honored the longest day of the year, a reminder of the sun's power and a plea that it lingered long enough to ripen crops. Summer festivals were times of strength when warriors prepared for raids in fields brimmed with promise. Then came autumn, the season of harvest, when the feast tables overflowed and relief spread through every household. The turning of the seasons was not only agricultural, but spiritual. Each shift reminded the Saxons of Weird, the concept of fate. Just as the seasons could not be stopped, so too were human lives bound to a greater order. Festivals gave people a chance to accept that fate, to honor the cycles that ruled them, and to find comfort in their predictability. Communities experienced these changes together. A poor harvest was everyone's hardship, a successful one, everyone's joy. Festivals made the turning of the seasons communal rather than solitary, finding families and clans in the shared acknowledgement that they were subject to the same sun, the same soil, the same gods. In this way, the Mere Hall fire was more than warmth. the feast more than food, the song more than entertainment. Each celebration was a ritual of transition, a way of walking through the doors of time together. The Saxons did not just observe the turning of the seasons, they lived inside it. Their lives as cyclical as the festivals that marked them. Though the smoke of their hearts has long since drifted away, the spirit of Saxon festivals still lingers in the traditions we recognize today. What began as communal fires in wooden halls and offerings of meat to the gods left echoes in later medieval feasts, church holidays, and even the rhythms of our modern calendar. Saxons may be gone, but their cycle of celebration remains woven into culture. Take Ule, for example. Its fires and feasts survive in Christmas traditions. The blazing hearth, the Ule log, the gathering of families around food and drink during the darkest days of winter. Spring fertility rites, once dedicated to the goddess Aostra, gave their name to Easter, where eggs and hares still symbolize renewal. Even the harvest festival, once steeped in pagan offerings, finds its reflection in harvest thanksgivings and autumn feasts that mark the turning of the year. The Saxons also passed down the idea that community is built around shared ritual. Festivals were not luxuries for them, they were necessities. A man who feasted with his kin was part of the circle, bound by loyalty and memory. To be excluded was to be cast adrift. That sense of belonging through shared meals and song resonates even now. Family dinners, seasonal gatherings, and national holidays all carry the same purpose: to remind people that they are part of something larger than themselves. Their legacy also lives in the tension between the sacred and the joyous. For the Saxons, no feast was purely religious or purely entertaining. It was always both. Sacrifice might be followed by song, solemn prayer by laughter. We too inherit that balance. Celebrations today mix ritual with merriment, ceremony with festivity. Perhaps the greatest legacy of Sax and feasting is its resilience. It proved that in a world often harsh and uncertain, people found ways to affirm life. Fire could chase away darkness, food could soften hunger, and fellowship could outlast fear. These truths are timeless. So, when we sit at a holiday table, raise a glass in celebration, or gather around a fire, we unconsciously echo the Saxons. Their festivals and feasts taught that survival was not enough. To live fully meant to celebrate, to remember, and to belong. And in that sense, their legacy still burns as brightly as any Ule.